the real backbone of what the John Adams has done since 1987 is literature, is fiction writers, starting with people like Norman Mailer and Saul Bellow, and it goes on and on. And I'm very happy that we have Ron Rash here, who is very much in that tradition and that caliber, a writer of who not only writes about a part of America that I think most people here don't have much exposure to, but does it with great form. Our moderator, Jan Donkers, is probably known to many of you. He probably knows more about American literature than a good many American literature professors. He himself, in fact, has been a professor at a couple of different universities in the US, including Berkeley. He has reviewed American fiction for a long time, and some nonfiction. He's also himself an author of short story collections and plays and novels. He last moderated our recent event with James Elroy, and if any of you were there, you might be surprised that we were able to bring him back. It was it was a lively and very unorthodox event, but anyway, we are very happy to have him. Let me introduce Jan Donkers.
The John Adams Institute even managed to bring mint julep in honor of our southern guest. Welcome, everybody. We even have to try to find some places in the back, but I think we will manage. Over there are a couple, and in the back there's one more. First of all, an admission I have to make. Until October 29 of 2008, I had never heard of Ron Rash, an ignorance I shared, I think, with many a reader this side of the Atlantic. I remember that date specifically because it was on that day that my then local newspaper, the San Francisco Chronicle, which is one of the few American newspapers, by the way, that still can allow itself the luxury of an albeit slim weekly book review. It published a glowing review of a book called Serena by that writer, Ron Rash. And I quote from that review: "The book is consistently heartbreaking in its portrayal of what humans are capable of. Rash's wealth of Smoky Mountain knowledge meshes seamlessly with an occasional touch of magical realism. This is a story that's sprawling, engrossing, and from time to time nightmarish. The tension builds so well that occasionally you just want whatever monstrosity is approaching to be over." I bought the book immediately, but after my return from the Bay Area, it somehow got lost in the pile of books to review that awaited me. And it was only after the Geus Publishing House in the Netherlands announced its intention to publish a Dutch translation that I got around to reading it. And yes, the Californian reviewer was right, as were the many, many other reviewers that applauded the book. Serena is that rare book that is both poetic and a page-turner. A historical novel with a Shakespearean touch, a great piece of writing that fully deserved to become a finalist for the PEN/Faulkner Award. So, are we proud to have him as our visitor tonight? You betcha, to quote a recent unsuccessful vice presidential candidate. Well, she may be more successful next time. Mr. Rash was born in 1953 in Chester County, South Carolina, and he grew up in Boiling Springs, North Carolina. His life and work are predominantly set in the Carolinas. He is a graduate of Gardner-Webb University and Clemson University, and apart from being a poet and a prose writer, he is the Paris, distinguished professor in Appalachian Cultural Studies at Western Carolina University. He made his debut in 1994 with a collection of short stories entitled The Night the New Jesus Fell to Earth, and since then he has published two more volumes of short stories, The last one of which is the recent Chemistry and Other Stories, of which he will read one, which includes Speckled Trout, and that's a story that brought him the prestigious O. Henry Award. In addition to that, he published 3 volumes of poetry and, of course, 4 novels, the most recent of which is Serena, his most ambitious one, and one that brings him broad national and international recognition, not in the least helped by the fact that it will be made pretty soon into a movie by Darren Aronofsky. Serena is, as many a Dutch reader is now beginning to discover, a wonderful book. It is a novel that is firmly placed in time and place, the Carolinas in the Depression era. It is a love story, but a grim one in that sense. It is a historical novel, but with a very topical ecological implication for our time. It's wonderfully written, with a good ear for the idioms of the era and the place. And last but not least, it is a shocking exercise in describing what human beings are capable of in their desire to gain power and wealth. It is a book that I have recommended since reading to everybody I met, and will be recommending for some time, including to all of you here present who have not read it yet. So it is a pleasure and an honor to give to you Mr. Ron Rash.
I'm so glad to be here, and one reason is that my father was an artist, and my middle name is Vincent, so I think you know who I was named after. He also wanted to name me Rembrandt Vincent Rash, but my mother drew the line. That would not work in Western North Carolina, a name like that, but I'm so happy to be here and so grateful, and thank you for that very kind introduction. I thought what I'd do tonight, as far as my reading, was read two short excerpts from my first and fourth novels, and then read a short story, one that our previous speaker suggested, so I'm glad to do that. And one thing I've tried to do in my work is to capture Appalachian speech. It's very different from speech in the rest of the United States. I don't know how familiar you are. If you've seen, unfortunately, if you've seen some of the movies, such as Deliverance, you would not believe anybody speaks in Appalachia, but we actually do, and with some eloquence, actually, I think. And as I was growing up, I was very aware. I spent a lot of time with my older relatives, and the language was very interesting. Many of the words were made up, showing it's a vital language, certainly. But a number of the words were actually Elizabethan, though I didn't know it at the time. I was really shocked when I went to graduate school. Words that I thought were Appalachian slang, I suddenly saw in Shakespeare and Chaucer as well. And so I wanted to read a scene from my first novel where I tried to capture some of the cadences and also the rich use of metaphor, which invariably uses the natural world, which I would argue is the most universal of languages. But in this particular scene, this novel is set in 1950s in a valley called Jocassee. And in this particular scene, a young man named Billy Holcomb, a young farmer, he and his wife Amy have tried to have a child for 3 years and have been unsuccessful. They finally gone to a doctor and found out that Billy is infertile. And because of this, the time, 1950s, a very traditional society, and there's a great deal of pressure on Amy to have a child from the community, from her own family, and it's really starting to tear the marriage apart. But in this particular scene, what Amy has done, she's actually decided to become pregnant by a neighbor because she feels like it's the last thing that she can do to save their marriage between Amy and Billy. And Billy understands this, but he's, as you might imagine, it's also very difficult. And this is a scene where he first acknowledges it. You couldn't give me a child. I had to be with one that could, Amy said the first week of August, when her stomach swelled like a muskmelon and neither of us could counterfeit any longer not to know. By then, that baby was about the only thing growing. Corn stalks stood dead in the fields, the beans half buried in gray dust. The only crop it looked to make it was tobacco I'd planted beside the river. That and some cabbage if the groundhogs didn't get it. Whose child is it, I asked. Like when I'd been down by the river that spring plowing, I hadn't looked up to see Holland Winchester saunter past the big white oak that marked the property line between his family's land and mine. And like when I came back to eat my noon dinner that day, my beans and bread wasn't ready and Holland had left his mark on Amy. A spot on her neck purpled like a fox grape. I waited for Amy to answer my question. My mind taking me back a month to the July afternoon I first suspicioned her being with child. The weather had turned summer by then, so the wash tub was out back near the well. After supper, Amy got her towel and such and went to bathe while I got my whetstone out and sharpened my scythe. She drawed her water early afternoon so it'd be sunny warm come evening. All she needed was to take off her clothes and get in. When I'd got my scythe sharpened, I tarried by the window and watched Amy bathe, because that was a sight so pretty as to make my heart ache. Not so much in a lusting way, but something somehow above that. A woman is never more pretty than when she's bathing, or so it was when I looked at Amy. A man bathes just to get dirt off him, but it seems more to a woman than that. Amy bathed in a slow, easeful way, like the soap and water washed away every care the day had laid on her. Then she took the tin and sloshed water over her head, and her yellow hair darkened to the color of honey. The sun had been slantways over Sassafras Mountain, so when Amy raised from the wash tub, the water streamed off her like melting gold. There's no angel in heaven more lovely than this, I told myself. Then Amy turned as she stepped from the tub. I saw the curve of her belly, a curve no more than the scythe blade I held in my hand, but enough to wonder me about her and Holland Winchester. I raised my finger to the blade and ran it across the edge. I felt the steel cut right through. Drops of blood, bright like holly berries, spotted the floor. I hadn't wanted to follow that trail where Amy's ripening belly led. I tried for a month to keep what I suspicioned about Amy and Holland clear in my mind, but it came creeping back when my thoughts got idle. What really set the fear in me wasn't so much Amy carrying another man's baby, but losing her to that other man. Because in the years we'd been married, she'd became a part of me ever sustaining as my legs. Even when I was in the fields and her up at the house, my thoughts was often upon her. I'd think of her in the house cooking or canning, knowing that though we was working apart, we was still working for each other. So all that July, I hadn't offered a word to Amy about her belly. I'd known once it was words, something would come of those words. If that something was losing Amy, I'd be in a fix I couldn't see my way out of. I'd been like a man in his field who sights a tornado hauling towards him and puts his head down, reckoning if he don't look up and admit to its coming, it might some ways pass him by. But Amy's belly kept on waxing like the moon. Now as the dog star raised up with the morning sun, the tornado I'd closed my eyes to had sucked me up in it, and I had no notion of where it would set me down. But I was about to find out on an August dog day when most everything that surrounded me seemed to lay down to die. Whose child is it? Amy said, repeating me as she raised her blue eyes to mine. It's my child, Billy, but it can be ours if you want. Her saying that gave me pause, because there's currents that run deep in a woman, too deep for a man to touch their bottom. I'd seen the look on Amy's face when her younger sister's children crawled into her lap. I'd heard her in the kitchen singing the last few months when I came up from my field. Amy had always carried a pretty tune, but there was a difference now, a kind of smile in her voice I'd never heard before. She hadn't been singing because of me or Holland Winchester. At least that's what I reckoned. But I had to know for sure. What about him? I asked, not wanting to own up Holland's name, because if I did, I'd bring his face and body back into the house. And I'd see what I'd been hauling in my head for months now. Holland Winchester and Amy in the back room, their clothes half off, him between her legs like a plow in a furrow. What about him, Amy said, repeating me again. You leaving me for him, I asked. For now that we'd started, it was best to go ahead and see how the land lay between us. Amy looked at me, her blue eyes steady as a plumb line. No, I'm your wife, Billy, not Holland's. I suppose that should have assuaged me some, but right then I didn't feel nothing like good. Every man must eat a peck of dirt before he dies, Daddy had once told me. I felt I was eating of it by the shovelful. When's the last time you saw him? 2 months ago, Amy said. As soon as I was sure it took, I told him not to come around no more. What'd he say to that? He didn't say much. I told him certain it was over and done with. Does he know you got a baby coming? No. That's not his concerning, Amy said. What's happened between me and him is finished, but it ain't finished between us without you want it to be. That child can be mine or it can be ours. Amy lifted her hand and brushed back a strand of yellow hair that had fell over her eye. So what you going to do, Billy? There's a valley on the North Carolina-South Carolina border called Jocassee Valley, or it was called Jocassee Valley. In the 1970s, it was flooded. People who had lived there for generations were forced out. Their homes completely underwater now, and it's a mountain lake. It's a very clear lake, probably as clear a lake as there is in the eastern United States. A very deep lake, some places 400 feet deep. And even today, you can actually go out on a boat on a calm day and you can look down and you can see the roads, you can see mailboxes, you can see where or you can see a graveyard. They actually dug the graves up, but you can still see where they were, and there's still some tombstones down there. And you can see houses, and it's one of the it's a very unsettling thing. I mean, it's almost as if there's a lost world down there. And my first novel, what I just read from, actually is set in that valley right before the flooding. But this story also deals with that mountain lake. And one thing that's rather interesting about the lake, Lake Jocassee, is that Jocassee in Cherokee means place of the lost. It's almost like hundreds of years before that lake came, they somehow knew. And there's a naturalist in the United States named Bartram. Some of you probably heard of William Bartram. And when he was one of the first Europeans to be in that, to see that area. And he was looking in his journal, he was keeping a journal, and he looked back, as he looked back at the valley as he was leaving it, he said it looked like a vast undulating ocean. And once again, just that irony, historical, of that almost sense of what it would become. But this is a story about that set near, or actually part of it on there, and Lake Jocassee. And Stevie Smith has a wonderful title for a poem, so I had to steal it. Not Waving, but Drowning. Across the room, a woman holds her front teeth in the palm of her hand. She stares at them as if they were a bad throw of the dice. The man who brought her through the emergency room door leans his cheek against her swollen face. You know I love you, he whispers. Her hand tightens around the teeth. A red drool is all she can get out before clamping her mouth shut, leaning her head back against the wall. The man yanks a soiled handkerchief from his back pocket. He wets the cloth with his spit and wipes blood from her mouth and chin. I turn to see if Mary is watching, but her eyes are closed, her lips moving. For a moment, I think she's praying, but she's doing what we learned at our Lamaze classes, counting to 10, then exhaling, slow and steady. Her hand presses her belly as if the spread fingers might somehow hold inside what's been there 4 months. I place my hand over hers, wanting to believe the weight of another hand might make a difference to the baby, to Mary. She takes away my hand, and I remember what she said as we sped here, the road coiling around the black silence of Lake Jocassee, where the night began one afternoon 4 months ago. It's our baby, not just yours, I'd said when she wouldn't answer my questions. Not yet, Mary had said. Not until it's born. Only then is it ours. A big man dressed in jeans and a black long-sleeve dress shirt shoulders through the door. His right hand is swollen like a snake bite, his knuckles scraped raw. The receptionist, a gray-haired woman in a white nursing uniform, has disappeared. When she comes back, she shoves a clipboard through a hole in the bottom of the glass that separates her from the circle of metal folding back chairs filled with varying degrees of misfortune. The man clutches the wrist below the damaged hand and raises it. Can't, ma'am, it's broken. The gray-haired woman pulls the clipboard back to her side, places her pencil on the first line. Name, she says, not even looking at him. I don't hear his name. I'm thinking 11 months back to another night. July, not June, but a night like this, muggy, loud with tree frogs and crickets. I'm thinking about how I'd woke in the dark and Mary was crying. A nightmare, I thought, and pulled her to me and felt what was too sticky to be sweat staining her skin. I touched a damp finger to my tongue and tasted blood. What's happened, I asked. The baby, she said. So we dressed and came here and sat in maybe these same 2 chairs and waited to be told what we already knew. The doctor said Mary should stay overnight, and they gave her a blue pill, and when the pill had done its work, I drove home and pulled the sheets off the bed, only to find the blood had soaked onto the mattress pad. So I pulled it off too and saw on the mattress a black spot like a water stain. Maybe it was lack of sleep, but for a moment I was convinced it had gone through the mattress and would cover the whole room if I didn't contain it. I jerked the mattress off. Through the box springs I saw there was no blood on the floor. I bundled up the sheets and mattress pad and carried them into the backyard. I dragged the mattress out there too, then soaked everything with lighter fluid and listened to the crackle of the fire, the tree frogs and crickets and a far-off owl. I was back at the hospital by first light. Mary didn't speak on the drive home. I let her wrap herself in silence. I pulled around to the back so she wouldn't have but a few steps. She saw the charred mattress, the wisp of smoke that rose toward a sky that promised a day without rain. You think it's that simple, she said. The man with the broken hand sits down next to the entrance. I look at my watch, 17 minutes since we came in. I step up to the window, bend to speak through the hole in the glass, but the woman is gone. The door at the back of the office is half open. I see that it leads to the other emergency room, the one where they carry you in on a stretcher. The receptionist finally comes back, leaves the door cracked behind her. We have to see the doctor now, I tell her. My wife may be having a miscarriage. Please. Just a few minutes more and the doctor will be free, she says. There's 2 boys next door. The woman nods toward the room she's just come from. They've been in a car wreck. Those boys are in bad shape. My wife's in bad shape too, I say. The baby is. I understand, she says. I sit back down. Just a few more minutes, I tell Mary. It won't be so long. Mary looks at me but says nothing. She's a cold bitch, ain't she? The man next to the door says to me. What? I say, hoping I heard wrong. Because if I didn't, I know this conversation will end with an exchange of fists. He nods toward the receptionist's glassed-in cubicle. I say she's a cold one. I look up to see if the receptionist has heard, but she's gone. The phone rings. They give them enough breaks, the man next to the door says. Damn, I don't think I'll put in an application here. Where I work, they won't let you go to the bathroom but once a shift. Where you work? Asked the man with the woman holding the teeth. Hamrick Mill. The man nods at the woman beside him. Her brother worked there a few months. He said they'd treat you like a dog if you'd let him. He wouldn't put up with that, so they fired him. What's his name? Billy Goins. Don't remember him. Like I said, he wasn't there but for a couple of months. The woman stares at the teeth in her hand. Is that your wife? Yes. The woman doesn't look up. It's as if she's deaf. Maybe she is. Maybe she's like the Cambodian women I've read about, the ones who witnessed so many atrocities that they'd willed themselves blind. Maybe that's what you have to do sometimes to survive. You kill off a part of yourself, your hearing or eyesight, your capacity for hope. What happened to her? The moment he speaks, the man with the hurt hand seems to realize the answer. I mean, she's going to be okay, isn't she? Accident, the husband answers. He places his arm around his wife's hunched shoulders. She's going to be fine. The door that leads into the examining room opens halfway. An intern, probably not even 30, grips the door's edge with both hands and leans his head in as if afraid to come among us. He glances at the couple across the room and then at Mary and me. Mrs. Triplett, he asks, looking at Mary. Mary keeps her hand on her belly as I ease her to her feet. I walk her to where the doctor holds the door open. You stay here, she says. I don't want you with me. Not until I know. I start to speak. No, Mary says, her voice rising. You stay here. So I do. The others have been listening. When I sit back down, the man by the door picks up a tattered sports field with his good hand, stares at the cover. The man with the woman takes a jackknife from his pocket and pares his nails. His wife is the only one who looks at me. I lean my head back against the wall and close my eyes, think about the day 4 months back that brought Mary and me to this place. One of those late February days you get around here, a kind of miracle when the sky opens up deep and blue and the temperature rises into the 70s. It's more than weather a couple of weeks ahead of schedule. There's no wind like there is in March or early April. It's like you've leapfrogged 2 months. All that's missing are the dogwood blossoms. Mary said we should fix a picnic lunch and go to Lake Jocassee. Take the boat out and eat our lunch on the far shore where the horse pasture river enters the lake. I was glad she wanted to leave the house. Gladder still she wanted to do something with me. Since the second miscarriage, she hadn't wanted to do much of anything but sit at home on weekends and stare at the television. We'd been more like roommates than husband and wife. I hadn't taken the boat out since September, so I checked it good before I hitched the boat trailer onto the car. Mary stayed inside and made our lunch. We were on the water by 10. Since there was no wind, I cut the motor halfway across and we drifted. We looked down in the mountain water so clear it was like peering through a window. After a few minutes, we saw what we were looking for. 80 feet down were farmhouses Duke Power Company hadn't bothered to raise when they'd built the dam. And not just houses, but barns, wood sheds, even mailboxes. Everything was there but the people. It's like if you watched long enough, somebody would walk out of one of those houses and look up and wave at us the same way we'd look up and wave at a plane, Mary said. Her saying that spooked me because I've been thinking the same thing. Not the part about the plane, but that there were still people down there, people who didn't know they were buried under 80 feet of water. I'd moored the boat in the cove where the horse pasture slowed and lost itself in the lake. We walked a quarter mile through woods that still had patches of snow and spread a quilt in a meadow we'd found years back, right after we'd gotten married. It had been cool on the water and in the woods, but here the noon sun poured down on us. The surrounding oaks and poplar trees seemed to wedge all the sun's heat into the meadow. A few wildflowers opened their petals. I took off my sweatshirt. Mary unpacked cheese, apples, a loaf of bread, and a bottle of wine from the picnic basket. I'd been expecting turkey sandwiches and Cokes. Neither one of us had been much of a wine drinker, and I almost said something about that, but I didn't. Mary seemed happy, and she hadn't been happy in a long time. Here, she said, handing me the wine, paper cups, and a corkscrew. Make yourself useful. In the distance, I could hear the last waterfall before the river entered the lake, but I heard nothing else. No boat motors, no squirrels or birds. You could have almost believed there was no world beyond the meadow's tree line. I handed Mary a cup of wine. To the future, she said, and tapped her cup against mine. She took a sip, then placed the cup on the grass and did not drink from it again. Our appetites were keen. We ate all the bread and cheese and halved an apple. When we finished, we put everything back in the basket and lay down on the quilt, drowsy from the food and warmth. I was almost asleep when Mary sat up and unlaced her hiking boots. She took off her sweatshirt. There was nothing, not even a bra underneath. Mary lay beside me and took off her jeans and then unbuttoned my shirt. I was surprised because I knew that it was the time of month she was most fertile. Since the second miscarriage, she hadn't let me touch her during this time, even with her diaphragm in. I felt the goosebumps on her arm, so I folded the quilt over us. What about your diaphragm? I asked. I want us to try again, she said, and pulled me to her. We slept afterward. I woke before Mary and listened to her breath merge with the sound of the waterfall. I lay there knowing our future together would come down to this last gamble because our marriage had barely survived the last miscarriage. If it had survived, I wasn't sure. Something happens to a couple after a miscarriage, or at least it had happened to us. You cry together, you talk to the counselor and preacher. You hear the same stupid and callous remarks from friends and kin who should know better. But there's still a part of the pain you can't share, even with the person who went through it with you. You carry that pain inside like a tumor, and though it may shrink with time, it never disappears, and it's malignant. Shadows had covered us by the time Mary waked. She'd pressed against me, and we made love again, then walked back into the woods, leaving behind the last rays of sunshine filtering through the trees, the wildflowers that would die in a few days when the frost returned. I opened my eyes, try to believe Mary's going to come through the door, smile, and say everything's okay. The woman across the room is still looking at me. She opens her mouth, slow like a rusty hinge. Her forehead creases. She speaks, a mumble of blood and words that I can't understand. No, darling, her husband says, placing his arm around her. Don't try to talk. Up the highway toward Westminster, I hear an ambulance, the wail increasing as it nears, then silenced as it turns into the emergency entrance. Red light drenching all of us as it passes the glass door Mary and I hurried through an hour ago. The telephone at the reception desk rings. Mr. Triplett. The receptionist motions for me. I walk over to the window. Dr. Walton needs to talk to you. He's down the corridor, second room on the right. Her voice is muffled by the glass. She points at the door as if we were in a place where we can only communicate in gestures. I look back at the woman with the battered face. Her brown eyes hold mine for a moment. She nods. And I want to believe that both our lives might somehow turn out better than either of us can believe at this moment. Not tomorrow or next week, just sometime. I take a deep breath and walk through the door that says, "Do not enter," and down the corridor. I walk slow as the dead might walk across the cold and silent floor of Lake Jocassee. Y'all gonna think I'm a real grim guy, aren't you? I'm kind of fun, right, Jill? I'm not morose, but I didn't realize that when John picked that story, that how they kind of intersected in a very kind of dark way. But I feel like I ought to make some jokes now, just to reassure you. But I am going to end, I think, at a bad spot for a character I think who comes out really well. When I wrote Serena, early in the novel, I had a very minor character named Rachel Harmon, very insignificant. But when as I got deeper into the novel, I really started getting intrigued with her. And she starts off in the novel really just with everything against her, as you'll see in this another upbeat scene. But she gradually becomes stronger, and in a novel where she's really up against an incredibly strong woman, Serena Pemberton, she will be the one that is the one that can equal her when no one else can. And but she, just as Serena is motivated by power, Rachel is motivated by love. I think she represents the best of us. And in this scene, it's early in the book, and it's a scene where her father has been killed by the man who got her pregnant. Another upbeat part, right? And the child, she's had the child, and the child has brown eyes like the man who has impregnated her and also killed her father and disowned her and the child. But in this scene, she is thinking about the price of love. And I'll end with this, and we can all go out in mourning. Yeah, she's just gotten a tombstone up for her father. She stood by the tombstone, dirt the stonemason had displaced, darkening the grave. Her father had been a hard man to live with, awkward in his affection, never saying much. His temper like a kitchen match waiting to be struck, especially if he'd been drinking. Rachel heard an older woman at the funeral claim her father had been a different man before her mother left, less prone to anger and bitterness, never bad to drink. Rachel couldn't remember that man. Yet he'd raised a child by himself, a girl child, and Rachel figured he'd done it as well as any man could have alone. She'd never gone wanting for food and clothing. There were plenty of things he hadn't taught her, maybe couldn't teach her. But she'd learned about crops and plants and animals, how to mend a fence and chink a cabin. He'd had her do these things herself while he watched, making sure she knew how, Rachel now realized, when he'd not be around to do it for her. What was that if not a kind of love? She touched the tombstone and felt its sturdiness and solidity. It made her think of the cradle her father had built 2 weeks before he died. He brought it in and set it by her bed, not speaking a single word, acknowledging he'd made it for the child. But she could see the care in the making of it, how he'd built it out of hickory, the hardest and most lasting wood there was. Made not just to last, but to look pretty, for he'd sanded the cradle and then varnished it with linseed oil. Rachel removed her hand from a stone she knew would outlast her lifetime, and that meant it would outlast her grief. I've gotten him buried in godly ground, and I've burned the clothes he died in, Rachel told herself. I've signed the death certificate, and now his gravestone's up. I've done all I can do. As she told herself this, Rachel felt the grief inside grow so wide and deep it felt like a dark, fathomless pool she'd never emerge from. Because there was nothing left to do now, nothing except endure it. Think of something happy, she told herself. Something he did for you, a small thing. For a few moments, nothing came. Then something did. Something that had happened about this time of year. After supper, her father had gone to the barn while she went to the garden. In the waning light, she gathered ripe pole beans whose dark pods nestled up to the rows of sweet corn she'd planted as trellis. Her father called from the barn mouth, and she'd set the wash pan between 2 rows, thinking he needed her to carry the milk pail to the spring house. Pretty, isn't it?" he'd said as she entered the barn. Her father pointed to a large silver-green moth. For a few minutes, the chores were put off as the two of them just stood there. The barn's stripes of light grew dimmer, and the moth seemed to brighten, as if the slow open and close of its wings gathered up the evening's last light. Then the creature rose. As the moth fluttered out into the night, her father lifted his large, strong hand and settled it on Rachel's shoulder a moment, not turning to her as he did so. A moth at twilight, touch of a hand, something, Rachel thought. As she rode back down the trail, she remembered the days after the funeral, how the house's silence was a palpable thing, and she couldn't endure a day without visiting Widow Jenkins for something borrowed or returned. Then one morning, she'd begun to feel her sorrow easing, like something jagged that had cut into her so long it had finally dulled its edges, worn itself down. That same day, Rachel couldn't remember which side her father had parted his hair on. And she'd realized again what she'd learned at 5 when her mother left. That what made losing someone you loved bearable was not remembering, but forgetting. Forgetting small things first. The smell of the soap her mother had bathed with. The color of the dress she'd worn to church. Then after a while, the sound of her mother's voice. The color of her hair. It amazed Rachel how much you could forget. And everything you forgot made that person less alive inside you until you could finally endure it. After more time passed, you could let yourself remember, even want to remember. But even then, what you felt those first days could return and remind you the grief was still there, like old barbed wire embedded in a tree's heartwood. And now this brown-eyed child. Don't love it, Rachel told herself. Don't love anything that can be taken away. But she will. And I've got to tell you, it will be a happy ending. So, you know,
Which side do you prefer? Okay. Yeah, those last words, "and she will," are not in the book.
No.
Because I underlined that sentence, don't love anything that can be taken away, because, of course, her love for that child is one of the central themes of the book and makes her escape from a brutal fate.
Exactly. Yeah.
So I'm glad you added that for those who have not. I mean, don't make it too grim. No, you're right. You're a product of the South, not the Deep South. The Deep South is Alabama and Mississippi, right? Yeah, yes. The Carolinas are
A very different South.
Uh-huh.
Yeah, I think people, not only in other countries, but in the United States, see the South as a single entity. But it's very different. And the area I'm in, which is the North Carolina mountains, is a very different culture from the traditional Southern culture, or what people perceive as the Southern culture of mansions and cotton fields. None of that in the region where I am. Yeah.
It's a region that historically has been associated with storytelling, oral traditions, and you referred to this in 2 separate pieces that I read, and I forgot where, but probably in a magazine or on the net, probably. And one which intrigued me very much, and one in which you tell how your granddad would read to you as a kid, and you realized after a short while that he could not read.
Right. Yeah.
And you call that one of the most remarkable moments of your life.
Yeah.
Can you, for those who have not read that piece?
Do y'all, are you familiar with Dr. Seuss, The Cat in the Hat? Or I don't know if you're familiar with the children's book, but when I was 4 years old, my mother had given me that book, and she would read it to me. It's just a few words on each page, and I pretty much had memorized it. But I took it to my grandfather's house one Sunday when we'd gone there to eat dinner with my grandparents, and he had opened the book. And when he opened it, he started reading a story that was very different from the one my mother had read, 50 times before that. And I thought that was very interesting. This story could kind of change. And the cat got into a lot more trouble. If you know the story, I mean, the cat was doing serious jail time, my grandfather's story. But I brought it back the next week, and my grandfather read it again. And the story was different. The cat got into even more trouble, this time. And each time I would give it to him, something would be different in it. I mean, after a while, the story was pretty much the same. But what I realized only years later was that he could not read or write, and he was too proud to let his grandson know that he couldn't read or write. Mm-hmm. And so he would make this story up. But it did this amazing thing for me, because I remember even at that time thinking, after he'd done that a couple of times, it was as if the words were like butterflies or moths. It was almost as if they could move around and reshape themselves. And one of the great disappointments of my life was in the first grade when mine wouldn't do that as I was learning. But yeah, that was rather magical, his doing that, and I think a good lesson in imagination.
Yeah. Well, talking about that, another important memory is listening to your older kinfolk gathering on the porch after dinner and talking, not just telling stories, but using words, as you mentioned, I think, that you could not pronounce. What was so particular about that?
I think what was really, it was wonderful, because I was able to hear a dying language. I think earlier you were talking about the Dutch. Mm-hmm. I mean, can you mention that? Because I think that's a good equivalent. You were mentioning the old man you talked to.
I mentioned at dinner an hour ago that I taught in Indonesia. When you talk to real old 90-year-old, 95-year-old Indonesian people, they speak a kind of Dutch language that is extinct, that doesn't exist anymore. And even more than that, they will excuse themselves, they will apologize. Neemt u mij niet kwalijk dat ik zulk ouderwets Nederlands spreek, zeggen ze dan. En dan zeg ik, and then I say, it's wonderful, I'd love to listen to you for hours, but they're ashamed of that. That's but that's a kind of speech that is like people in a valley, right, that have no contact. The same. I talked to a professor. Oh, he died recently, but from East Flanders, mm-hmm. And he went to teach in South Africa, and he spoke, and he said, "It's amazing. Afrikaans is so similar to the language that my parents spoke in West Vlaanderen." So those are the
right.
examples.
Yeah, and where the Appalachian Mountains, as you may or may not know, is an area that has been kind of set apart. The mountains make it that way. I mean, it's a very has been a very isolated part of the United States, and so I think I was very fortunate. It was almost like a part of the language was trapped there for generations, and also not only that, but a lot of the music, the ballads. If you like country and western music, bluegrass music, folk music, almost all that comes out of the Appalachians, and it's that tradition.
The greater part of, or almost all of your work is situated in the Carolinas, and reading your novel and your short stories, I was thinking, well, God forbid that Ron Rash will ever write novels situated in Manhattan after 9/11, or I mean, about yuppies pretending to be traumatized by. But this is a sideline. I shouldn't have said.
Well,
that.
Actually, I agree with you. I think that's.
But you are oftentimes labeled a regional writer. Maybe this will end with the success of Serena. But does the term have a negative connotation also?
I think sometimes it can. And what I find very interesting is that how am I a regional writer and say someone who writes about 9/11 in New York City is not? I mean, they're both regions, right? I mean, and it's very interesting how that term has been used with Southern writers. And I think in part because one thing that, if you've read much Southern literature, there's always a very strong sense of place. I mean, you always know where you are. You know the humidity when you read Faulkner, Eudora Welty, Flannery O'Connor. And I think that's Southern writers' landscape is almost always very powerful.
It goes even further than that. When you use the quote by Eudora Welty, another Southern writer, and I think the quote is, I know because I wrote it down here. One place understood helps us understand all other places better. So that even transcends that sense of being at home in the place, being able to write about that.
Yeah. And I love to read writers who write about places I've never been. I love Gabriel Garcia Marquez, his work. I love that landscape. But I think what to me, regional writing is not a negative term if you see it in the sense of a writer who is writing about a particular place, but in a sense almost like a farmer drilling for water. The writer goes into that place deep enough and true enough, he or she will hit what is true of all human beings. I mean, in a sense, it's almost like the particular is the way into the universal by knowing that one place very intimately. I think Faulkner is a great example of that. James Joyce in Ulysses, I mean, there's not a more regional book than that. I mean, all that takes place in Dublin in 24 hours. Philip Roth is a writer I admire, and once again, he has a very strong sense of place. I think when you read Roth,
you know a lot about New Jersey.
New Jersey, yeah.
Yeah, it's true.
Yeah.
Is it true that you have a portrait of Flannery O'Connor staring down?
I do.
Yeah.
I do. Flannery O'Connor is one of my heroes, and when I write, I don't know if you know much about her, but she could be a very prickly. Do you know the term prickly? I mean, someone who's how would you say that? Terse. And but where I write, I have a black and white photograph of her, and she never smiled in any of her pictures. I don't think she ever smiled in her life, actually. But she's looking down at me and just like saying, "You're not good enough yet, kid." She keeps me in my place. But yeah.
Is that one of the photographs with her peacocks?
No, it's actually just one. Yeah, with her a black and white. She's got these severe glasses on. I mean, she's really glowering.
Or just just a.
Just this
okay.
part, yeah.
So not with the crutches and the
I've seen those
and the
photographs,
peacocks. Yeah. Did you read her biography?
I did.
Yeah,
I did. I thought it was well done. Very balanced.
It was very well done. It had some very grueling scenes in it, like the Danish man who pretended to love her, and then afterwards said that asked how did it feel kissing her?
Yeah.
It felt like kissing a corpse.
That's not what you want to hear.
That's not what you want to hear. No. I'm talking about good friends. I'm talking about. Let's talk about Serena a bit, about the book. Then I noted that you said somewhere in an interview that you'd never outline a story, which intrigued me because the novel was preceded by a short story, which is in this collection, by the way. And which can, in a way, be read as a Reader's Digest version, and I don't use that term negatively, in the sense that it has several passages which you used almost word for word in the novel, but it has a very different ending, and it works on far less levels than the novel. So I was wondering, having that as an outset, and having this as the result, how could you not outline?
I don't. I mean,
That's the end of my question.
Yeah, and I was telling a friend of mine recently that the more I write, the more mysterious it is. I'm not saying in some kind of cosmic way. Aliens are not transmitting messages to me, but I mean, it's very strange to me why. Well, this whole novel started from a single image of a woman on horseback, Serena. But I never outline, and I never really know where it's going. And that's scary as a writer because I never am sure until I really, usually about 6 or 8 months in, even if this is going to be a novel. But there are certain lies that writers have to tell themselves in order to stay reasonably sane. And that, I don't know I don't know any completely sane writer, but one thing I always believe, because every novel I've written has begun with a single image. The novel I read from first actually began, that scene I read, I had an image of a farmer standing in a field, and the whole novel came from that. But what can happen is that if that image is so strong and it stays with me for days, I can't get it out of my head, it's almost embedded in me, I really feel like there's a novel there already. In a way, I feel a little bit that Michelangelo believed that when he saw the marble, uncut marble, the statue was already in it. And in a way, I feel that image, if it's a true image, the novel's already there. Now, on one hand, I know that's ridiculous, but it's something I have to believe, and I make myself believe it. And the novel.
Now that image that you're talking about is one about a strong, blonde, tall woman on a striking horse.
Yes.
Who, of course, is Serena.
Right.
But there's another. Maybe not an image, but something, an object that started your novel, which is a table.
I was actually in near where I live in the North Carolina mountains. There was a timber camp in the 1920s, and in the timber camp, I went in there actually just a few months before I started Serena, and I'm sure that had an impact on all that come together. There was a table, or there is a table, you can still go there, and it's about 8 feet, 3 meters wide, from about here to the door, and it's from a single piece of wood. A single tree. And actually they made 5 tables out of that tree. The tree was a poplar tree, and it was, I think, 125 feet high when they cut it down. And they measured it. And that just really struck me. But also what struck me was these timber barons actually almost like a trophy. As they would eat on it and they would drink. And in the novel, it became that. And one thing that's interesting, for people who don't know the region well, for instance, if you've seen pictures of the Smoky Mountains, I'm sure some of you have, the Smoky Mountains Park, it looks like virgin wood, virgin timber, pristine. It's never. But if you had seen it 80 years ago, the ridges would have been completely cut. Almost all of the Smoky Mountains were cut during that period, almost every tree. And very few people realize that. There's very little virgin forest left in the eastern United States, but there, actually, there are just a few big trees left in that forest that were uncut.
And this is, of course, one of the interesting levels that your novel works on, because the devastation in the early 30s at Pemberton, and especially his wife, Rack, is one of the themes in your book.
Yes.
And so that has a very real historical background. What I liked a lot in the novel is you read a part about Rachel, a little part. What I liked a lot is the early juxtaposition of Serena and Rachel. 2 chapters, almost side by side, I think, or 2 parts of a chapter. One in which Serena presents herself as a person very intent on destroying everything around her in search of wealth and power, everything that nature has offered. And in the next chapter, Rachel is very humbly collecting ginseng and roots and
replanting
and to earn some extra money. Was this juxtaposition, was this done intentionally, or
very much so. Yeah, very much so. Rachel and Rachel thinks in metaphors from the natural world, so she's very deeply connected, and she knows how to grow crops, but she also knows how to preserve them. When she takes the ginseng plant, she very carefully puts the seeds back in, so she will ensure it will regrow, because she knows that this is land that she will, it's been in her family a long time, and she wants to preserve this land. So, whereas I think Serena represents obviously the other pole, where I will just raise this and move on. Yeah.
A lot of reviewers, almost all reviewers, I think, refer to the fact that Serena herself is a present-day Lady Macbeth. And as Lady Macbeth, just like Lady Macbeth, she thinks her husband is too weak to commit the murders that she deems necessary to pursue her goals. So she commits to him herself with the help of a man that is almost enslaved to her by an accident. She even has problems sleeping, I noted, just like Lady Macbeth.
Very much.
Yeah.
Very
But unlike Lady Macbeth, and that's one difference maybe, she does not seem to have moral inhibitions or a conscience whatsoever. Was it difficult to create such a ruthless character? Absolutely ruthless character.
It was fun.
Because it was a woman or not?
I thought it would be intriguing, to have a woman like that, because, while I did want to evoke some comparisons to Lady Macbeth, I do feel Serena is a much stronger woman. I mean, Serena is never remorseful for what she does, but she was a lot of fun, and one reason was as I got deeper into the novel, I began to realize that, particularly in American literature, there are not many women, really strong women, who have the power of life and death in our fiction, and I thought that would be interesting, particularly at a time when a woman would have had a lesser opportunity to do this, to have this woman come into this all-male world and dominate it. I thought that would be an interesting premise, and to become almost mythological to the men who work for her, because she can do everything they can except better. And I thought that would just be an interesting story.
One reviewer said that she almost, we're talking about women figures in American fiction, she almost seems to have stepped out of Ayn Rand's imagination. Well, that's not fiction, but it's certainly it's a kind of world that she, that she is close to.
Actually, I wanted that. I actually went back and looked at, reread some Ayn Rand, and when I was writing this, and also Nietzsche, and
maybe Jack London also.
Yeah, London would certainly,
because his fascination with power and violence and survival of the fittest, and
I read London. When I was young, I read
everybody reads John when he's young, and then forgets about him. And everybody knows about Ayn Rand, right? Yes. We don't have to explain. I'm happy I don't have to explain. I hate that woman. So. Another reference to not only to Lady Macbeth, but to traditional drama is the chorus, which I liked a lot, because you intersperse it very, very well. The dose is very well done. It's the chorus of the timber crew that comments on what goes on, and thereby help the narrative along. They explain for the reader what he has not seen, because you don't see any of the murders that she commits, but you read or you learn about them from the timber crew, that as a little chorus, just like in an Elizabethan play. I mean, I don't have. My question obviously is, did you do this on purpose? But you did, of course.
Oh yeah. Well, I really wanted. I'm glad you brought that up, because one thing I really wanted in this book, maybe as much as anything, was I wanted the book to have the feel of Elizabethan drama. I love Marlowe. I love Shakespeare. I love reading them, and I love the kind of, very often the way that the larger than life characters, and I really, to me, she's very much a Marlovian character. If you know Marlowe's work, Faustus and Tamerlane, those stories, plays, and actually in the book, I was trying to find a way to elevate Serena's language, which is very educated, above the other timber owners who were also well-educated men and and I deliberately had a lot of her speech be iambic, very often iambic pentameter, because I wanted to even bring in that, the Elizabethan iambic line. So yeah, that was very conscious, and the chorus, using the chorus, the wise fool, who
Yes.
at the end actually does have wisdom.
Yes, yeah. Unlike some of the other people who pretend to have wisdom.
Right.
But yes, you mentioned somewhere that, you mentioned it in the back and at the acknowledgements that some of the minor characters in the book actually existed, and I presume that Mr. Caphart
Yes.
did exist.
He did,
because
yeah.
he reappears in the bibliography that you
Right,
documented. What kind of person
Yeah,
was
Horace
he?
Caphart was one of the most interesting men I've ever read about in my life. He was a Harvard-educated librarian. He moved to St. Louis, Missouri, the middle of the United States, married, had, I think, 6 children. I think it's 6 children. And then nobody knows exactly what happened, but for some reason, he left his family, and he wanted to find the most isolated area in the eastern United States. He actually got out a map, and where he could find the most green and the smallest dots where cities were, which is where I live, in the land beyond the cell phone. He just left his family and went into the woods and lived as a hermit. I mean, amazing life. And he wrote several books while he was there. He's a very good writer. One's called Our Southern Highlanders, and it's a wonderful book. But he just essentially left the human race and went and lived this very isolated life. But he did this wonderful thing. And one thing that heartens me when I did the research was how many people in the 1920s in the United States during a depression fought for a national park. I mean, it's amazing. And Horace Caphart was one of the leaders of that. He led that, and actually the Rockefeller family was very important. They donated $5 million. School children in the region where I live gathered up their nickels and pennies. But it was a pretty amazing effort to build that park, especially when you had the timber interest sometimes violently opposing it, blackmailing people. It got very ugly, very political, buying off politicians.
Well, reading your novel and some of your stories and poetry, I gathered that a lot of that concern about the future of the planet, as far as endangered nature is concerned, is your own concern.
Yeah. And I mean, like all of us, I'm guilty of hypocrisy. There are things I should do better as far as that, but I try, And I just think that, we can no longer, and I think particularly America. I mean, America is such a big country that I think there's this sense that we've had traditionally in America that you can just move on. There's always a place to move on, but now we can't go anywhere else.
You can always move on. Yes.
Yeah. But I think Americans are realizing that, and I think it's not just recently. Teddy Roosevelt, our president, was wonderful in this respect. He understood how important the national parks would be, and he really did heroic work for our country in the 20s and set a really wonderful precedent.
Mm-hmm. One of the least likable characters, he's a minor character, and he gets killed also by Serena, is a doctor. Now, of all the thousands of names that you could have chosen,
I know where this is going.
you call him Cheney.
Yeah, well, that is not an accident. I will just put it that way. That is not an accident. I think it's a well-deserved name.
Okay.
Would you agree?
Yeah, absolutely. I agree. Yes. For those of you who have read the Dutch, or have not read the book, or have read the Dutch translation, because it lacks in there, can you relate? Because you tell about this in a postscript in the American edition. some aspects of the book that you researched, but particularly the role of the Mongolian eagle. That Serena, maybe you should first explain for those who haven't read the book how Serena uses the eagle, and then you research for that particular angle.
Yeah, that the most fun I had. I love to do research, and the most fun I had on Serena. I mean, I got to interview some loggers in their early '90s. I guess if there's, I think they're still alive. One of them's almost 100 now, who had actually been a timber cutter in the Smoky Mountains at the very time I was writing about, and that was wonderful. But the best interview was with an eagle hunter, and what I did was I wanted something in the novel that would make Serena mythic to these men. I mean, something that would really impress them, something that they had never seen before. And I came up with the idea that one thing that these men were very frightened of was what are called timber rattlesnakes where I live. And these are, very poisonous snakes, and you can die from their bite. And there were always men getting bitten by these snakes when they were working in the woods.
And I lost a leg, at least.
Yeah. And I thought, well, what if Serena could, shoot them? And I said, well, that's good, but it's not mythic. And I thought, well, maybe she can train a dog. And I said, well, that's impressive, but I want something more than that. And I knew from just being outdoors that hawks as well as eagles hunt snakes in the wild. And I thought, well, what if she could train an eagle to hunt those snakes? And I thought, boy, that's a great idea. And then the next thought is there any way I can get any reader to possibly believe that? Was that just over the top completely? So what I did was I started searching for somebody who would know, and it was very convoluted. But eventually, I found one of 12 people in the United States who actually hunts with an eagle. And to do that in the United States, the bird has to first be declared a nuisance because it's killing sheep or livestock. Then the person who wants to train the eagle has to go out and capture it himself or herself, then train the eagle, and then hunt with it. And I found a guy who did that, a man named Scott Simpson. And one thing I've learned when I do research is I always look for the fanatics. I mean, the people that care about only one little thing in the world, and I love talking to these people because they're just obsessed with one thing. And the first thing they always tell me is, you'll never get it. You'll never understand the complexities of the Shea train engine, for instance, or the 1928 hearing aid. But once you get them going, they won't shut up, and they'll give you these things that I could never have dreamed of. I mean, and it was funny. I was trying to find out about a 1928 logging train engine, and I found a guy in Pennsylvania who actually had restored one. And he said that what he and his friends did for fun was they watch old movies to find out which train wasn't supposed to be there. That's how they live their lives. I don't think they even have jobs. I mean, that is their job. Being outraged that they got the wrong train engine. Anyway, I digress. So Scott, I said, I gave him the premise, and he said, yeah. He said that would be unusual, but yes, you could train an eagle to hunt a rattlesnake. And actually, since that time, I've actually found out someone that's done this and actually trained a hawk as well. But anyway, so I started getting interested in it. I started asking Scott questions, and he led me through it, and he kind of got into it too. He got excited about this, the idea that an eagle was going to be in my novel. And he said, and he actually and one night I was talking to him, and I kept hearing this chirping, and I thought my cell phone was going out. And I said, Scott, my cell phone's going out. I may have to call you back. And he said, no, that's my bird. The bird lives in the house with him. I mean, that's the kind of people we're dealing with here.
And we're talking about a big bird.
Yeah, we're talking about a big bird, because what Scott finally said was, if you really want to make this bird impressive, it needs to be a bear goot. And, as if I knew what a bear goot was. But a bear goot is a Mongolian eagle. It's a golden eagle, but it's one that's been bred. If you know about the Mongolians, they have this great pride in their hunting birds to this day. And Scott started, he sent me videos. He had friends who had hunted there. And they hunt this bird is huge. I mean, you should, it's got a huge wingspan, and its talons are so powerful they can crush a human skull. And in Mongolia, they hunt wolves with these birds. Now, as we say in North Carolina, that's a badass bird. You go after a wolf. And Scott just kind of trained me along with him, But it was so much fun. And actually, one of the parts that was most fun was getting the bird from Mongolia to North Carolina. I had a lot of fun bringing him to Charleston, overseas, and it was fun.
You mentioned, and you repeated that at dinner, that Serena is the apotheosis of your career. You quoted somewhere that saying that I feel that this is the best thing I'll ever write. How can you're a young man. How can you say such a thing? You're only in your 50s.
Well, I hope I'm wrong, but it was a book. It's a book that felt different. This was my 11th book, but this book felt different from the start, and I approached it in a way I've never written the way I did this one. I was writing for the first month. I was writing about 10 hours a day, 7 days a week, and even then I was getting up in the middle of the night. I couldn't sleep more than 2 or 3 hours. I just became consumed with it because it's almost as if the whole story came to me, and I was just frantically writing it down. Mm-hmm. And I really worked. I probably averaged 8 hours a day for 3 years on it. And when I'd finished the book, about a week after I'd finished it and finally sent it off, someone I work with said, "Something's different about you." And I had 3 different people tell me that they could tell a physical difference once I'd sent the book off. So
you'd given birth.
Oh, well, I don't know. I'm not going to claim it's the same thing, but it was an exhausting experience, but exhilarating too, because the writing parts of it came very easily, which is what you always hope for. But it was I've never had an experience like it.
Will you be involved with the movie version?
No.
No?
No. I feel like as a writer, once someone else purchases the novel for a movie, that's their artistic, baby now, and I feel like I don't want to get involved with that. I think that would not be good for me as a writer. It would distract me from what I am. I'm a novelist and a short story writer, and I would not feel comfortable being really. I mean, I've actually answered some particular questions, but I told him I really didn't even want to see the screenplay, and I'm not saying that in a negative way, but I just feel like this is their take on the novel. So I'm staying away from that. Yeah.
Who would be a good Serena?
Well, according to the magazines, Angela Jolie is interested, but how much of that's true, I don't know.
Could be worse. I have a couple of questions about your other work, but maybe first, before we run out of time, have the audience have their say about Serena or other things that you would like to ask Mr. Rash. Yes.
My name is and I know what you mean about writing. I wrote to Happy Hooper, and it took me 9 months. I also like to give birth to a child. But is Serena based on a real person at all somewhere, or total fantasy?
I did not base her on anyone. She just kind of came to me. But as I got more and more into her, obviously, I think the fact that Medea certainly plays into it. Obviously, the Shakespearean characters. There was I cannot remember her name. Probably somebody in the audience knows. There was a woman who was a pharaoh and she was strong. She was so strong that they put a beard on her. Do y'all know who I'm talking about? Yeah. I went back and researched her, and also Queen Elizabeth. There's a scene in the novel where Serena stands on essentially a map of South America, but this huge map, and Queen Elizabeth did that, and also Tamerlane does that in Marlowe's play. This idea of just dominating the world.
Mm-hmm. Some more questions? Yes, in the back.
Tomato, is it really Appalachian?
Instead of Appalachia? Yeah. Yes. This is how you, if you want to prove you're a real Appalachian, you will not say Appalachian. Yeah, it's interesting. People outside the region very often say Appalachian, but within the region, it's Appalachian. Yeah.
What's the background of that word?
Yeah, I'm sure it's Cherokee. I should know that, but I'm sure it's Cherokee.
Some more questions from Mr. Rash.
Yes, sir.
Over there.
You mentioned seeking out fanatics when you do your research. Any fanatics that you especially found fanatical, put it that way,
Yeah.
in doing your research? Because it sounds really interesting. You come across a lot of people that have these incredible interests, like eagle hunting.
Yeah.
The writer also said, it was amazing to meet me. And within half an hour, they were telling me all about them, and they forgot who I was. I was just a great public. Any particular fanatics that sort of strike you as specifically?
Oh, yeah. Well, yeah, a number of them. Actually, that experience with the hearing aid. This woman got very upset with me that I didn't understand that there was a difference between the 1928 A model and the 1928 D model of a obscure hearing aid, because I had a scene where just, it was one sentence in the novel, but, she was very upset that I hadn't, done years of research and had a PhD in it or something. But, yeah, and one of the strange things, which probably says something about me, is that they seem to seek me out now, which is kind of spooky. I actually had I wrote my third novel was about a massacre during the Civil War in North Carolina. A lot of people don't realize this, but the area I'm from was pro-Union during the Civil War. Most of my relatives fought for the Union. That area, very few slaves in that area, and my family fought for the Union. But anyway, I had a scene in the novel which I'd researched extensively, and actually it was reported in the New York Times about the massacre, about who died when, because actually the last person killed in the massacre was a 12-year-old boy. So in the novel, I have that happen. Well, these guys called me up, or actually emailed me, and they were ghost hunters, or paranormal people. And they had gone to the gravesite and found out that I was wrong, that indeed, this boy had not died last. It was very important that I know this, and the last line, I thought this was just great. He said, "And we all have jobs," which I doubted, but anyway. So yeah, I kind of draw them, which is only fair, yeah. I actually wrote an essay, at the back of Serena, about being among the fanatics.
The American
let me
version,
read.
yeah.
I'll read the last paragraph of that, because I think one thing as I make fun of them, I have to realize something that's true, and that is that, as I say here, let's see, this is okay. I finish up, at about the same time I received an email from a self-proclaimed paranormal investigator. His team had visited the massacre site and obtained compelling evidence. That's their word, not mine, about this. But anyway, the last paragraph in this essay is, "Bizarre episodes indeed, but I suppose no more bizarre than being contacted without warning by a total stranger who demands meticulous information about something he knows nothing about. A stranger who spends much of his waking life creating imaginary people and imaginary worlds, yet who's also obsessive about placing the correct factual details within a 300-page lie that he spent 3 years making up. And so it is that whether I contact them or they contact me, I know that I am, perhaps more than I care to admit, among my own kind."
More questions from the audience? Nope. I have a couple more about your other work. Not only Serena started out as a short story, but so did The World Made Straight, which you referred to. I did not read that one, but the short story, you referred to the Civil War era. But the short story that is in this volume is set in the present.
Right.
How does that work out in the novel?
Actually, the story, in a sense, what happened during the Civil War, comes back to haunt the people in the 1970s. Because the families, what happened in the actual Shelton? There was a notorious event called the Shelton Laurel Massacre in North Carolina. And it was during the Civil War, and as I said earlier, there were a lot of Union sympathizers in the North Carolina mountains. But there are also some Confederates, and some Confederate soldiers rounded up 14 Union sympathizers, including a 12-year-old boy and a 14-year-old boy, and they took them out in a field and they killed them, shot them down. And in the novel, these people all were from the same county. And to me, it was a microcosm of what we've seen in Rwanda and Cambodia. I mean, it's that same kind of horrific where people who've known each other for generations suddenly turn. But the novel actually is about the descendants from one family, a young boy who's from the family that was massacred, an older man, a teacher, former teacher, from the family, descended from the family who did the killing. And there's a kind of, the older man knows this, the boy doesn't. And there's a kind of attempt on his part to kind of right it a little bit by helping this young man. And so that.
And he is the guy who gets caught in a bear trap.
Yeah, the young man is, yeah.
Attempting to steal a third part of the harvest of marijuana.
Right.
That is, yes, okay. Which is one attempt too many.
Right, yeah, twice, yeah. 3 you don't want to do. Yeah.
There is another story in this collection which I liked a lot. It's called Chemistry and Other Stories, and it's a wonderful, not only it feels wonderful to hold, but it's also a wonderful short story collection. There's one that has a more topical, recent connotation than, or appeal, I should say, than the others, and that's called Cold Harbor. Yeah. Can you tell us a bit where that came from? Yeah. I mean, it's set in the Carolinas, but it could be set anywhere in the United States. Right.
Yes. It's about a nurse during the Korean War in 1950s, and she was a nurse in Korea, and a soldier who's very seriously injured. She saves his life, and then several years after that, she comes back to the United States. She's still troubled by the men that she saw die, and she's having some problems in her own life. And she decides to seek out the man, hoping that seeing him will, in some ways, perhaps make her feel better, and perhaps help some of this haunting that she's feeling, some demise of that. But unfortunately, at least initially, he is not what she, or he has not become what she thought he would, or. He's very bitter and still very injured, and so the story. But also it's called Cold Harbor because she actually stops on the way, and Cold Harbor is where one of the most ferocious Civil War battles was fought. Incredible carnage in just a few minutes there. So it's a story about war. And actually, I was writing. I had two students that were in Iraq the first time. And I wrote that story during that period because I knew where they were headed. And
but the good thing about one of the good things about it is that it could be any war. In Korea, I didn't even bother to check the details. Could have been Vietnam or Iraq and for that matter, the Second World War. And well, I'd like to conclude with asking you to read. Maybe a couple of the poems from Eureka Mill, one of the volumes of poetry that Mr. Rash published. It's a coherent, a thematical, coherent volume. Maybe first you could explain what it's about, and then. Well, I have a couple of favorites, but you probably will. Maybe could.
Okay, you pick one. I'll pick one.
Okay. Well, you know which one I'm going to. I'm going to pick the song.
Okay. You just don't want me singing it, believe me.
The Ballad of Ella Mae Wiggins.
Yeah. Let's see now. Have we got the page here? you remember the page? It's been a while since yeah, there we go. This is actually something that in the turn of the century into the 30s, 40s, 50s, 60s, textile mills, cotton mills were very important in the North Carolinas, in North Carolina and South Carolina. And a lot of the people from the mountains would go into the mills to work. I mean, I'm sure this has happened all over the world. I mean, people moving from the country to the city, seeking jobs. And it was a very dangerous job, and many people were hurt. And finally, there was, in the 1930s, there was an attempt to unionize, and it didn't happen. And you can, and even today in the South, unions are very weak. That's the weakest, I guess it's probably the weakest area as far as unions in the United States. And a lot of it goes back to what happened in the 1930s and 20s. But one of the leaders of the union movement was a woman named Ella Mae Wiggins, who was from North Carolina. I think she had 6 or 8 children, but she pretty much was the leader in North Carolina. And during one of the strikes, she was actually shot and killed. It wasn't an accident. They just hunted her down and killed her because they knew she was an instigator. Mm-hmm. And she died. Actually, I can't remember. They either shot the tires out of the car, but somehow the car had stopped. They'd shot at the car, and then she got out, and she was running across a cotton field. And she was killed. And of course, cotton was the product that they made, they used in the mill. But this is a ballad of it, and I will not sing it because that would run everyone out of here very quickly.
But it's time to leave anyway.
This will do it. This will do it. Yeah. It was the 14th of September in 1929 when she made her last stand in a cotton field a few miles from the South Carolina line. We won't forget the day strike breakers struck poor Ella Mae down. They shot her in the chest and let her die, then took her body into town. She was just a lint head on this earth, but in heaven she'll wear a crown. We won't forget the day strike breakers struck poor Ella Mae down. Oh, mothers, tell your children this sad tale, so they will tell their children when they're grown. She sacrificed her life to save the Union. Eureka workers, that's a cotton mill. She was one of your own. So don't forget the day strike breakers struck poor Ella Mae down.
Beautiful.